The Apex Institute occupied Station Meridian, a rotating marvel of engineering that hung in neutral space like an extremely expensive Christmas ornament. 500 kilometers of corridors, laboratories, lecture halls, and student housing designed to accommodate beings who breathed everything from oxygen to sulfur hexafluoride. The station cost more than some planetary economies and generated approximately as much drama as a reality television series, except with actual consequences and fewer commercial breaks. 12,000 students from 63 species attended classes here, each convinced their civilization had peaked precisely when they personally decided to apply. The admissions office worked overtime, ensuring exactly the right mix of species, academic credentials, and financial contributions. Democracy was lovely in theory, but someone had to pay for all those specialty atmosphere processors. Humanity had joined the galactic community exactly 10 years ago, which in cosmic terms was roughly equivalent to showing up at an established book club and suggesting they switched genres entirely. The existing species, Kryn warriors, Thessian scholars, Vexali telepaths, and approximately 60 others, had spent millennia perfecting their academic traditions. Humans arrived with enthusiasm, coffee addiction, and an alarming tendency to question fundamental assumptions everyone else had stopped examining centuries ago. The Institute's board of directors, demonstrating the kind of wisdom that looked good in promotional materials, decided forced integration would solve millennia of ingrained prejudice. Brilliant strategy, really. Nothing builds friendship quite like mandatory proximity between species whose previous interactions involved trade tariffs and territorial disputes. They mixed classes with algorithmic precision, ensuring maximum diversity and minimum comfort for absolutely everyone involved. Advanced xenobiology met Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in Laboratory Complex Theta, a space designed by someone who clearly believed ergonomics were optional. The workstations accommodated exactly 0 species perfectly, achieving a sort of egalitarian discomfort. Professor Lyra Esch, a Thessian whose 3 brains made her perpetually overcaffeinated without actually consuming caffeine, taught with the enthusiasm of someone explaining molecular biology to particularly dense furniture. Mira Chen occupied Workstation 7, 3rd row center, hunched over a microscope that required constant recalibration because human and Thessian optical standards disagreed on fundamental levels. Her specimen slides contained tissue samples from 17 species, cross-referenced and cataloged with the kind of obsessive precision that made research librarians weep tears of joy. She'd fought for this position. Not physically. Attempting physical confrontation in an academic setting was grounds for expulsion. And besides, she'd lose against approximately 90% of the student body. But academically? That was different territory entirely. And humans had advantages there that didn't require 4 arms or natural armor plating. Humanity's admission to the Institute had come with conditions that everyone pretended weren't discriminatory. Limited enrollment slots, extended probationary periods, mandatory cultural adjustment seminars that other species mysteriously never attended. Mira had scored in the 99th percentile on entrance examinations, spoke 6 languages, including 3 requiring vocal cords humans technically didn't possess, and had published undergraduate research on cross-species immune response that made her professors back on Earth suggest immediate graduate placement. The Apex Institute had accepted her application with the enthusiasm typically reserved for tax audits and dental appointments. Her first year involved advisors gently suggesting alternative paths, perhaps communications, cultural studies, something that didn't require, advanced biochemistry, where humanity obviously couldn't compete with species who'd been manipulating genetic code since humans were discovering agriculture. Mira had smiled with perfect politeness and registered for advanced xenobiology anyway, along with comparative physiology, molecular engineering, and bioweapons countermeasures. Because if you were going to prove something, you might as well prove it thoroughly. The Kryn occupied the back workstations like territorial predators surveying their hunting grounds. Their species had built a civilization on 3 pillars: military dominance, biological superiority, and the absolute conviction that their way represented objective, universal truth. They averaged 8 feet tall, possessed 6 limbs configured for either delicate manipulation or efficient violence, and had never encountered a problem they couldn't solve through increasingly aggressive posturing. Vekthor embodied every Kryn stereotype with the precision of a propaganda poster. He claimed the back row's central position, prime territory naturally, surrounded by his cohort of admirers and enablers. His exoskeleton bore the color markings of 3 military academies and 2 research institutes. His 6 limbs typically arranged themselves in configurations calculated to maximize apparent size and minimize apparent patience with inferior intellects. He'd established his opinion of human students during orientation week, when he'd publicly questioned whether the institute had implemented charity admissions. Professor Lyra Aish had issued a mild reprimand. Mira had said nothing. Everyone had moved on, which only encouraged him. Their first direct confrontation occurred during a laboratory practical on bacterial mutation rates. Mira's analysis had been elegant, efficient, and completely contrary to established Kryn doctrine, which insisted all biological processes followed predictable hierarchical patterns. Vekthor had called it chaotic human guessing masquerading as science. The teaching assistant had called it innovative thinking, and given her the highest marks in the class. Relations had deteriorated steadily from that point. Professor Lyra Esch's 3 voices spoke in overlapping harmony, a Thessian trait that made lectures either fascinating or migraine-inducing depending on one's neurology. Today, we address the semester's major project: designing universal medical protocols applicable across multiple species. Your challenge is creating treatment methodologies that account for radically different biochemistries. Medical protocols. Wonderful. Nothing exposed species biases quite like discussing whose biology counted as standard and whose required special accommodation. The professor's primary voice continued. The challenge lies in metabolic variance. A treatment saving a Vexali could prove lethal to a Kryn. A Thessian medication might be recreational drugs for humans. Who can identify the primary obstacle? 12 appendages rose in various configurations. Vekthor's 6 limbs extended simultaneously because subtlety was for species with insufficient limbs to make redundant gestures. Vekthor. The obstacle is lack of standardization, he announced, voice carrying that special confidence that came from never questioning one's own assumptions. Species evolved chaotically, resulting in inefficient biological variance. The solution is establishing baseline protocols using the most successful species as templates, then modifying for others as needed. His implication was clear. Kryn biology is the standard, everything else as deviation requiring correction. One perspective, Professor Lyra Esch acknowledged neutrally, which in academic terms meant technically an answer, but completely missing the point. Other hands rose. A Vexali student suggested telepathic diagnosis. A Thessian proposed AI-driven custom protocols. Each answer reflected their species' particular advantages and blind spots. Mira's hand went up last. She'd learned this trick: let the obvious answers exhaust themselves first, then offer something actually useful. Miss Chen. We're thinking about it backwards, Mira said, pulling up her datapad. Holographic projections bloomed above her workstation, showing interconnected biological pathways. There is no universal biology, so trying to force one is asking for disaster. Instead, we should map the underlying principles that all biology shares: energy metabolism, cellular repair, immune response, and develop protocol frameworks that adapt to species-specific implementation. She expanded the display, showing branching pathways. Like programming languages, you don't need to speak the same language if you understand the logical structure underneath. Create the framework. Let it translate to each species' biological language. The laboratory went quiet. Even the ventilation systems seemed to pause. Professor Lyra Esch's three faces showed three expressions of interest, which was either very good or terrifying. Elaborate. Take immune response. Kryn use aggressive cellular elimination. Thessians use adaptive identification and isolation. Humans use inflammatory response combined with targeted antibodies. Completely different mechanisms, same ultimate goal. Eliminate threats without killing the host. Design protocols that recognize the goal, then implement through whatever mechanism that species uses naturally. She was aware of attention focusing on her. Multiple eyes, optical sensors, heat-detecting pits. The Institute's diversity meant judgment came in many sensory configurations. The complexity of mapping these frameworks would be enormous, Professor Lyra Esch observed. Initially, yes. But once established, you could treat any species without needing to become an expert in their specific biochemistry. The framework handles translation, like having a universal medical dictionary that adjusts to whatever language the patient speaks. Vekthor's low hiss carried across 3 rows of workstations. Theoretical nonsense. Typical human overcomplication. Effective medicine requires understanding biology, not hiding behind metaphorical programming languages. Mira didn't turn around. No need. Understanding biology is exactly the point. Understanding principles that apply across biology rather than memorizing 63 different systems. What you call principles are surface-level observations. Vekthor stood, all 8 feet and 6 limbs of him. The movement was calculated to dominate space, to remind everyone of hierarchies, both physical and intellectual. Your species discovered antibiotics 80 years ago. We've been engineering genetic solutions for 3 millennia. Perhaps demonstrate appropriate humility. The professor's middle face frowned. Vekthor, we maintain professional discourse. Professional discourse requires professional equals. Vekthor descended from his workstation, each step deliberate. Other students shifted, creating space, avoiding involvement. Standard primate and pseudo-primate behavior when dominance displays occurred. The human proposes frameworks without foundational knowledge. Medicine demands proven methodology, not creative metaphors. He reached Mira's workstation. Up close, the size difference was pronounced. His shadow fell across her samples like a territorial claim. Your universal framework is undergraduate philosophy dressed as science, he said, voice dropping to something almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. Shall we discuss the 37 ways your approach would fail in practical application? Or would you prefer to acknowledge that human medical science is inadequate for multi-species complexity? Mira saved her work, closed her datapad with deliberate care, looked up with an expression of polite interest that could have been packaged and sold as diplomatic training material. I'm always interested in constructive criticism. Please enumerate the failures. First, your assumption that biological principles translate universally ignores. His mid-right limb reached toward her sample tray. not quite grabbing, but clear intention to appropriate her work, to demonstrate authority over her research and her space. She moved the tray smoothly aside. "I'd prefer you didn't contaminate my samples. I'd prefer you didn't contaminate serious research with amateur theories." His lower left limb swept outward in a gesture that appeared almost casual. Except everything Vekthor did was calculated. The motion connected with her research samples. 17 species tissue cultures she'd spent 9 weeks preparing, sending the entire collection crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking containment vessels echoed with crystalline finality. Specialized growth mediums splashed across the floor. Tissue samples degraded instantly upon atmospheric exposure. 9 weeks of meticulous work became biological waste in approximately 3 seconds. The laboratory's background noise, equipment humming, students working, ventilation cycling, became the loudest thing in the room. Mira looked at the wreckage, looked at Vekthor, looked back at the wreckage. When she stood, she did it slowly, without hurry, without aggressive body language that might provide justification for what had just occurred. That was 9 weeks of research. Then you should have secured your workspace properly. Vekthor's expression showed what might have been satisfaction among humans, but was probably something more complex in Kryn psychology. Consider it education in protecting valuable assets, applicable to both research and life. Professor Lyra Esch's 3 voices spoke simultaneously in alarm. Vekthor, destruction of another student's research, was accidental. Vekthor interrupted, not breaking eye contact with Mira. Entirely accidental. Perhaps if human laboratory practices met proper standards, such accidents wouldn't occur. Mira knelt down, began collecting the largest pieces of broken containment vessels. Months of work, hundreds of hours, tissue samples from species that required special permits to research. Now decorative debris. When she straightened, something in her expression made several nearby students take involuntary steps backward. "You know what?" Her voice carried that particularly dangerous kind of calm that made predators nervous. "You're absolutely right. My laboratory practices need improvement. My theories need practical testing. My approach lacks validation." Vekthor's satisfaction increased. Admitting inadequacy demonstrates growth potential. So let's do this properly. Mira set the broken pieces on her workstation with careful precision. Public demonstration. You and me. We each design a universal medical protocol, present it to the faculty medical board, defend our approaches. Let actual experts judge which methodology has practical merit. The satisfaction flickered. "I don't need to prove afraid?" Mira's eyebrow rose. "Interesting. I thought Kryn valued direct competition. Or does that only apply when victory is guaranteed?" Every species had trigger points. For Kryn, questioning their courage ranked somewhere between capital offense and declaration of war. Their entire cultural identity revolved around meeting challenges directly. Backing down from direct confrontation was social death. Vekthor's exoskeleton plates shifted, a physiological response to anger he couldn't completely suppress. "Fine. 3 weeks. Medical board review. Universal protocol design with practical demonstration. When I expose your inadequacy publicly, perhaps the Institute will reconsider charity admissions." 3 weeks, Mira agreed. May the best methodology win. Vekthor returned to his workstation with the swagger of someone who'd already won. His cohort immediately clustered around, offering congratulations for putting the human in her appropriate place. Professor Lyra Esch's 6 eyes fixed on Mira. Miss Chen, are you certain? Completely certain, Professor. I'll submit my formal proposal by tomorrow morning. She gathered her broken samples, her datapad, her notes, walked out of the laboratory with her spine straight and her expression neutral. Only when she reached the corridor, when the door sealed behind her with pneumatic finality, did she allow herself the smallest smile. Because Vector had made a critical miscalculation. Multiple miscalculations, actually, but one stood out. He'd assumed human stubbornness was the same as human stupidity. He'd assumed she'd approach this like a Kryn, with direct confrontation and established methodology. He'd forgotten that humans hadn't survived Earth through superior strength. They'd survived through pattern recognition, social manipulation, and the particular talent for holding grudges across geologically significant time frames. The next 3 weeks would be educational. Just not for the audience Vector expected. Mira's quarters resembled the workspace of someone experiencing either a breakthrough or a breakdown, and casual observers might struggle distinguishing between them. 4 holographic displays floated in midair, each showing different layers of her research. Her walls had vanished beneath printouts, tissue scans, molecular diagrams, and what might charitably be called organized chaos. She'd slept approximately 14 hours total across 6 days. Her coffee consumption had reached levels that would alarm medical professionals of any species. Her roommate, a Vexali exchange student named Teshra, had stopped asking questions after day 3 and simply started leaving care packages of caffeinated beverages and nutritional supplements outside Mira's door, with encouraging telepathic messages. But Mira wasn't just designing a medical protocol. She was designing a statement. Her research had expanded far beyond the laboratory confrontation. She'd accessed 70 years of Kryn medical literature, analyzed their treatment philosophies, identified their systematic blind spots. She'd cross-referenced with human medical history, looking for patterns, for approaches that conventional galactic thinking overlooked. Kryn medicine was impressive in its directness. Identify problem, eliminate problem, move forward. Their treatments were powerful, reliable, and utterly predictable. Biological hierarchy meant treatment hierarchies, aggressive intervention following established patterns, which meant they were also inflexible. Mira's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up case study after case study. Her universal framework wasn't theoretical anymore. She'd run the protocols through 23 different biological models, stress-tested the assumptions, and discovered something beautiful. It worked better than her initial projection suggested. The key was thinking in systems rather than specifics. Kryn medicine guaranteed results through aggressive intervention. Mira's approach accepted biological diversity, worked with it, turned variance itself into an advantage rather than an obstacle. A message alert chimed. Teshra, checking if she'd achieved sentience or ascended to a higher plane of existence. Still carbon-based, Mira typed back. Mostly. You should consume nutrients, also experience unconsciousness, also possibly consult medical professionals regarding your stimulant dependency. After Friday. After Friday, you'll either revolutionize galactic medicine or require medical intervention yourself. Preferably be conscious for whichever occurs. Mira smiled despite the exhaustion. Teshra was correct. She saved her current work, established 4 backup copies across different servers, and forced herself to step away from the displays. Meanwhile, across campus in the Kryn residential complex, Vector approached his design with the confidence of someone who'd already won. His protocol was powerful, elegant in its hierarchical simplicity, and completely conventional. Which was acceptable. Conventional worked. 3 millennia of Kryn medical advancement proved it. His cohort praised his design enthusiastically. None mentioned it was essentially a refined version of existing Kryn medical doctrine with minor adjustments for other species. Innovation wasn't the Kryn way. Perfection of existing excellence was. Vekthor spent approximately 8 hours on his presentation, confident that his species' reputation and his personal authority would carry the day. The human was clever, he'd admit privately. But cleverness without proven methodology was just elaborate noise. Friday arrived with the kind of bright morning that made optimists smile and realists check for incoming disasters. The Apex Institute's medical auditorium could seat 1,200. For this demonstration, every seat was occupied, and another 300 attendees crowded the standing areas. News of the confrontation had spread through student networks with the speed and accuracy of quantum-entangled gossip. The faculty medical board consisted of 9 professors from 7 different species, arranged behind a curved table that suggested both authority and accessibility. Professor Lyra Esch sat slightly left of center, her 3 faces showing professional neutrality. Dean Zorkath, an elderly Kryn whose medical innovations were legendary, opened proceedings. We gather for academic demonstration and theoretical review. Both participants will present universal medical protocols, defend their methodologies, and respond to faculty inquiry. We expect professional discourse and mutual respect. His 6 eyes fixed meaningfully on Vekthor, who showed no indication of noticing. Vekthor of Kryn Prime will present first. Vekthor rose with the kind of confidence that filled auditoriums. His presentation materialized in holographic glory, a 3-dimensional rendering of biological elegance. The protocol was sophisticated, hierarchical, unmistakably designed to impose order on biological chaos. The hierarchical medical framework, he announced, voice projecting to every corner. Universal treatment protocol based on proven Kryn medical methodology, adapted for lesser species biological limitations. Treatment success rate, 94% across tested species. Response time, immediate. Complexity level, manageable for trained practitioners. He walked through technical specifications with practiced authority. The biochemistry was sound. The medical logic was sophisticated. The underlying assumptions were completely conventional, dressed in impressive terminology. Current galactic medicine suffers from excessive specialization, Vekthor continued. My framework establishes Kryn biological principles as the universal baseline, then modifies for species-specific deviations. The result is efficient, immediate, and reliable. His demonstration showed simulations of various treatments. Infections eliminated, injuries repaired, genetic disorders corrected. Everything resolved through aggressive, direct intervention. It was convincing the way a hammer was convincing, effective when properly applied. The faculty asked questions. Vekthor answered with authority, occasionally with condescension when questions revealed insufficient understanding of Kryn medical philosophy. Several professors' expressions suggested this wasn't improving his evaluation, but he seemed not to notice. Metabolic variance accommodation? Professor Trinok asked, her crystalline structure chiming thoughtfully. Accounted for through scaling factors. Kryn metabolic efficiency serves as baseline, adjusted proportionally for less efficient species. Species whose biology contradicts Kryn models? Biological principles are universal. Species that deviate significantly from optimal configurations require more extensive modification, yes, but the framework remains applicable. So, species similar to Kryn receive better treatment. Vekthor's hesitation was brief. Species receive appropriate treatment. Some biological configurations are objectively superior. Several faculty members' expressions shifted in ways that suggested Vekthor had just made a significant tactical error. He concluded with a summary that essentially repeated everything previously stated with slightly different words, then returned to his seat with satisfaction that someone had just delivered truth to the insufficiently enlightened. Mira Chen will now present. Mira stood, and the contrast was almost theatrical. Where Vekthor had used the entire stage, moving with dominating confidence, Mira simply walked to the podium with her datapad and a small case. She looked nervous. Several audience members interpreted this as confirmation the human was outmatched. They were about to receive an education. The adaptive medical framework, Mira began, voice steady despite what her body language suggested. A universal protocol system that treats biological diversity as an advantage rather than an obstacle. Her holographic display was less immediately impressive than Vekthor's. No dramatic interventions, no hierarchical structures, just an interconnected network of principles and pathways pulsing with mathematical relationships. Vekthor's framework is sophisticated. It's also exactly what you'd expect. Establish one biology as standard. Force everything else to conform. It would work adequately, provided you had unlimited resources, compliant biology, and no ethical concerns about declaring some species optimal and others deviant. A murmur rippled through the audience. My approach is different. Instead of fighting biological diversity, we embrace it. We map underlying principles that all carbon-based life shares: energy metabolism, cellular repair, immune function, genetic expression, then develop protocol frameworks that adapt to species-specific implementation. She pulled up her research, explaining complex biochemistry in clear language alongside technical details. Think of it like translation. You don't need everyone speaking the same language if you understand the concepts they're expressing. My framework identifies the medical goal, then implements it through whatever biological mechanisms that species naturally uses. Professor Lirayesh leaned forward, all three faces showing interest. The mapping complexity is substantial initially, Mira acknowledged. But that's one-time investment. Once established, practitioners treat patients without needing encyclopedic knowledge of every species' biochemistry. The framework handles translation automatically, like having a medical interpreter that understands every biological language. She clicked through simulations. Unlike Vekthor's direct interventions, hers showed treatments that adapted. Immune responses triggered through species-appropriate pathways, cellular repairs using native mechanisms, medications that worked with biology rather than against it. Now, I anticipate objections. This is complex, unproven, relies on biological principles in ways we haven't fully tested. Mira's expression shifted. The nervousness evaporated, replaced by something sharper. So I ran practical tests. She opened her case, removing 17 small vials. These contain tissue samples from 17 species, including Kryn. I've subjected each to identical pathogenic exposure, a modified bacterial infection calibrated to threaten all carbon-based life. She placed the vials in a display holder. Several showed obvious infection, discoloration, cellular breakdown, biological distress. These 7 samples, she indicated them, were treated using Vekthor's hierarchical medical framework, scaled appropriately for each species. The damage was visible even to non-experts. These 10 samples were treated using my adaptive medical framework. The difference was stark. The 10 samples looked healthy, showing minimal infection damage and active recovery. Vector's framework works excellently for species biologically similar to Kryn. For everyone else? She gestured at the damaged samples. Not so much. My framework adapts treatment to each species' natural biology, resulting in better outcomes across the board. The auditorium erupted with noise. But wait, Mira continued, voice cutting through the commotion. There's more. Vector's framework includes Kryn tissue, so let's examine that specifically. She pulled up detailed scans of the Kryn tissue sample treated with Vector's protocol. 94% success rate, he claimed. Technically accurate. The infection was eliminated, however. The scans showed cellular damage, metabolic stress, recovery complications. The treatment worked, but caused secondary complications requiring additional intervention. Now the same Kryn tissue treated with my framework. The contrast was undeniable. The infection eliminated with minimal collateral damage, faster recovery, no secondary complications. My framework treated Kryn biology using Kryn biological mechanisms, just optimized. Because I didn't assume Kryn biology was the universal standard, I treated it as one valid biological configuration among many. She looked directly at Vector. Her expression was polite, professional, and absolutely devastating. Conventional protocols work adequately when you're treating biology similar to your own. For everything else, different species, edge cases, unusual presentations, the adaptive framework offers better outcomes because it doesn't fight biology. It works with it. She paused, letting that sink in. Essentially, Vector's approach requires biology to conform to medicine. Mine requires medicine to conform to biology. One approach assumes superiority. The other assumes diversity has value. Dean Zorkath's 6 eyes studied both presentations, in silence. The other faculty members engaged in quiet discussion. Mira waited, hands folded, looking far more composed than anyone had right to be after publicly dismantling a Kryn warrior scholar's work. Finally, the dean spoke. Both presentations demonstrate technical competence. However, practical demonstration reveals significant differences. Vector's framework shows strength in familiar applications, but concerning limitations in diverse scenarios. Ms. Chen's framework demonstrates superior adaptability and, critically, better outcomes across species variants. Professor Lyra Esch's middle voice added, additionally, Ms. Chen's approach shows ethical consideration beyond pure efficiency. Medicine that treats some species as baseline and others as deviations raises troubling philosophical implications. The verdict emerged through faculty consensus. Mira's framework was superior technically, ethically, and practically. Vector sat motionless, 6 limbs hanging slack, experiencing what was probably the Kryn equivalent of existential crisis. His entire worldview, Kryn biological superiority, hierarchical treatment, established methodology, had been systematically dismantled by a human with 17 tissue samples and a willingness to question assumptions everyone else accepted. The auditorium emptied slowly, students clustering around Mira with questions, congratulations, and sudden desire to be associated with someone who'd just revolutionized medical theory. Vector remained seated, watching the celebration from a distance. Several of his cohort had quietly migrated toward Mira's growing crowd. Eventually, he stood, walked down to where Mira was explaining adaptive protocols to eager students. Waited until she noticed him, which she did with the kind of awareness suggesting she'd been tracking his approach the entire time. I underestimated you, he said, the words clearly difficult. Yes. Your framework is unconventional. Also yes. In Kryn culture, when fairly defeated, we acknowledge it. His 6 limbs moved in a complex gesture Mira's cultural training recognized as formal respect. You won. Decisively. I was arrogant. This was inappropriate. Mira studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Apology accepted. Your framework wasn't bad, for the record, just limited. Sometimes conventional approaches work perfectly. And sometimes you need a human to demonstrate that the universe is more diverse than you assumed. Sometimes, Mira agreed. She hesitated then. Want to see the detailed mapping? The species-specific adaptations get really interesting when you compare mammalian versus crystalline metabolic pathways. Vector hesitated then. Yes, I would value that education. The Apex Institute's news network ran the story under the headline, Human Student Revolutionizes Universal Medical Protocols. The galactic medical journals picked it up within hours. 7 different medical research institutions submitted formal collaboration requests. Mira's inbox exploded with opportunities she'd spent 2 years hoping for. And in advanced xenobiology on the following Monday, when Mira entered Laboratory Complex Theta, everything had changed. The Kryn students in the back rows nodded acknowledgement. Other students smiled instead of looking away. Someone had left a new set of tissue samples on her workstation, replacements for those Vector had destroyed, but better. Collected from species she'd had difficulty accessing. A collective gift, an acknowledgement. Professor Lyra Esch started class promptly. Today we continue with medical framework applications. Miss Chen, perhaps you'd lead discussion on adaptive protocol implementation? Mira pulled out her datapad, loaded her notes, and began explaining concepts that a week ago would have been dismissed as human overcomplication. The galaxy was beginning to learn what humanity had known for millennia. Problems weren't solved by the strongest. They were solved by whoever figured out the rules everyone else had stopped questioning. And in the grand tradition of every underestimated species throughout history, humanity had shown up late to the galactic community, looked at how everyone else operated, and said, "That's functional. Have you considered doing it completely differently?" The Institute's administrators would later call it a watershed moment in human-alien academic relations. The students just called it the day Mira Chen made a Kryn warrior rethink his entire civilization's medical philosophy using 17 tissue samples and an attitude. Somewhere in the quantum foam underlying reality, probability waves collapsed in ways suggesting the universe itself was entertained. After all, it had been doing things unconventionally for approximately 13.8 billion years. About time someone noticed and applied the lesson to medicine.